everybody, and welcome to Introduction to Manual Focus and Exposure for Digital Cinematography. Thanks again for joining me. We're kind of going back again. If you've joined us for some of the cinematography workshops so far, we want to kind of re-explore and also introduce for anyone who's joining us for the first time, introduce what manual exposure and focus is, and these are really key concepts. So it never gets. I always find I learn some new things too, even just exploring these. So these are really kind of the key constructs of digital cinematography. So we want to go over these and make sure that we can really understand what everything means when it comes to this. So so once again, my name is Tom Strand. I'm the lead digital artist of the Creatorspace Mobile Digital Arts Project. You're joining us, and I want to thank all our partners in this project. So we have our the Canada Council for the Arts. And then we have our library partners. We have the Blue Mountains Public Library, Collingwood Public Library, and the Wasaga Beach Public Library. So again, thanks to all the library partners in the project. So those three libraries, that's where you can access our digital arts computers and also digital arts equipment. So we have the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K camera kits available at the Blue Mountains Public Library and also at the Wasaga Beach Public Library. You just need to go to our website, tbmcs.ca, finish an online proficiency test if you haven't done so already. And then if you just have a library card, you finish the test, you have a library card at those two libraries, Blue Mountains or Wasaga Beach, you can then go and take out this amazing kit. So what I'm demonstrating today, this camera, you can go and access right after. So I'm hoping that you'll see what's possible, get an understanding, and then you can go and explore the camera as well. And I think that's really the key, is to take it out, explore, see what it has to offer, and then, and learning is really just taking equipment and trying things out, and don't necessarily put massive objectives of, I'm going to shoot this big film or this documentary right away, or an arts project. First take out the equipment, and you always want to become familiar with it, and you can't become familiar enough with it. You're always going to learn new things and get faster, more comfortable, until it's just kind of part of your toolkit in terms of what digital cinematography is and how that will work for you. So that's really important. So we'll be going over the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera. As you can see behind me here, I have a little bit of a still life set up, pumpkins and a little bit of a snow moose, and we'll be looking at that as we come along. So here it is, and we'll be looking at exposure and how that kind of works. And then also, what does it mean to deal with the camera and to make that work? So that's the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera. That's what we'll be looking at in terms of the demonstrations. And then I'm hoping that you'll, get inspired and go and check out the camera if you haven't already done so. So that's really the goal here, is to make everyone feel comfortable with this camera and understanding just the difference. Because as we get into manual cinematography, now we're really used to using like our phones, autofocus, auto exposure, and it's all kind of done electronically. But now we have a lens, we can decide how much exposure happens, how little exposure, and we decide what's in focus, what's not in focus. And that's a real important creative tool. And if you think about any kind of artistic medium, you decide what people see, what people don't see. If you're painting, you decide what part of a scene people see and what is off screen, what's on screen. You decide what's the focal point, what might be out of focus in the background slightly. You decide what kind of light is being used if you're painting. Same with photography. So now, we're just looking at how to manually control these things. So that's really our goal here. So let's jump right into it. So here it is. So today we're going to look at the manual cinematography introduction, and then the ISO, or film speed, also ISO, and referred to as ISO or ISO, exposure, f-stop, t-stop, what that means, and that's just basically numeric representations of how much light we're letting into the lens, focus, range and depth of field, exposure and depth of field, and we'll talk a bit about frame rate too. And then as always, we can always have some Q&A, online, or especially you can always email me, tom@tbmcs.ca. Always happy to answer any technical questions about the equipment, creative discussions about how to achieve specific goals that you're looking to with your digital cinematography as well. So manual cinematography. So unlike the auto video modes, so we have that again with our phones, iPads. You as a digital cinematographer, you get to control the entire image. So our kits that we have at the Blue Mountains Public Library and the Wasaga Beach Public Library, these are total manual cine lenses. So, what ends up happening is they basically, you have lenses just like this, and, there's the f-stops, and then you have also like a focus ring. So you're deciding, how much light's going through the lens and what's in focus. And these are manual prime lenses we're using as well. So, and that's the key. So prime being that it's one specific focal length. So it's either like a wide lens, a normal lens, you might call it, or a telephoto lens. So more of like a zoom lens, telephoto. So unlike zooms on a phone or a zoom lens in general, it's one lens that you can go from wide to telephoto, but now we're going with manual, you're switching lenses. And that's really the fun part, is that to be able to switch lenses and play around with, what you see, what is your frame rate, right? So that's, I think, really important. Okay, perfect. So, so I hope everything's working. I just saw a little bit of an unstable connection, but it looks like I want to remind everyone that you can always rewatch this as we get into reviewing this and rewatching it. So we should be back up. I'm just looking at it now. So yeah, everything's looking good as we speak. So that's the good news. And you will be able to rewatch this. And we also post all of these on our YouTube channel. And there's a wealth of the cinematography workshops as well. So again, just what we're talking about is these these manual lenses where you have the exposure, you have focus, and they're all prime lenses, meaning that they're a specific fixed focal length, and they're not zoom lenses that might be you zoom from wide to telephoto. These are wide all the way up through to like a telephoto. So a close-up lens or a wide lens to get landscapes, or a normal lens, which is usually basically what you're looking at me, is in about a 35 millimeter lens, and that's kind of our human eyesight. So that's the idea there with what we call a normal lens. Okay, so three primary methods of manual control. We have our film speed, or that's our sensor sensitivity, our ISO. Then we also have our exposure, which is the aperture expressed in f-stop or t-stop. Then we have our focus, our range of focus or depth of field. What's in focus, what's not in focus. And depth of field is basically how much stuff is in focus. So for example, you're looking at me right now and the background is a little bit blurred. So that depth of field is specific to, you're seeing, let's say from about here, my hand, to maybe behind. So about a meter is the depth of field that's in focus. But if I come closer, I'll be out of focus. My hand starts to get out of focus. And the background behind me, way behind me, is a bit blurred and out of focus. So that's what we refer to as depth of field. So that's the focus. And the exposure is how much light, how much light are you seeing, and so on. So that's really the fun part. So these three things are our manual control methods. So that's exactly how that works. Okay, so the next thing. So ISO, or film speed, refers to how much, the light sensitivity of the digital imaging sensor. So the lower the number, let's for example say ISO 100, which is what the Blackmagic cinema camera's minimum is, the more light is required to properly expose an image. And the higher the number, let's say an ISO of 1600, you need less light. So what I'm demonstrating in conditions today, we'll be working at 300 to 1250 or 1600 roughly. So working with different ISOs to obtain our optimum exposure, and we'll look at what that means and how to identify what is proper exposure. Because we're looking now as our LED monitor on the back of the camera is a guide post. It's what you see is what you get. It's instant. You see it, and you can react to it. So it gives you a real representation of what the image looks like, but we'll also look at some of the scientific ways to explore that as well to make sure that's working. Okay, so the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K model also has dual native ISO speeds. So we have 400 and 3200, like the native, and there's a range then of 100 to 25,600. So it's a real big range. So there's two native ISOs that you can switch between, and then you can reduce or you can increase the light sensitivity. So it's a digital representation. So in the past, uh, the the ISO, or the film speed, was literally how much light sensitivity film emulsion had. So an actual real negative. So there would be larger grains would have more light sensitivity. Smaller grains would have less light sensitivity and require more light. Now this is kind of interesting because it correlates to the digital image. So as a light sensor on a digital cinema camera, if you put more gain up, so you have more light sensitivity, you start to get more grain. And that's how film reacted as well. There would be larger grain to, larger grain size to have more light sensitivity, and then smaller grain size would require less light sensitivity. So it would be finer, the grain wouldn't be as apparent, but the higher film speeds, the grain is more apparent. And that's the same thing that happens. We introduce a bit of noise as we put in more light sensitivity. So it's just something to think about in terms of, how much noise are you comfortable with, and how that's going to work. So that's always a really good, you know, how a good representation of how things can work with the light sensitivity of the digital cinema sensors. So that's really important to think about. Okay, exposure and manual aperture. So manual exposure relates to how much light is allowed through the lens by the aperture. This opens and closes. The f-stop represents how open or closed it is. The smaller the f-stop, the more light that is allowed through. For example, an f-stop of 2.8 or 1.5 is totally open. Then the aperture is closed at its minimum light allowance, which is 22, an f22. So what exactly does that mean? So essentially, I'll try to see if we can, just get an idea of this. But if we have this, you can see right here through the peephole like that. If I open it up, you can see that's open all the way up. And as I close it, you can see it's tiny. So this would be, it's like 2.8. And then I'm closing it down to 22. So it's a little pinhole. So you can see it literally is letting light in or closing. More light, less light. All the light it can possibly let in, and as little light as it possibly can let in. So that's really all that it does, and it's just represented by numbers. So in this case, this lens is a 3.1, is open all the way, and then 22 is closed all the way. And that's as simple as it is. It's just the numbers, and you're deciding how much light or less light to come in. It sounds really complicated, but that's all we're doing. We're opening and closing it, and that's what's done digitally with your phone. It's also just letting how much light goes in or out, but it's just done through a digital process versus this analog actual lens process, right? So that's just something to understand, and that's how our manual exposure happens. Okay, then focus is about, distance and range. So manual focus, it's based on setting one spot or distance into focus. Now, there's a correlation. The higher the f-stop, the more things are in focus. So the larger the depth of field is. So if you have 22, that means you're going to have the most depth of field possible. If we're open all the way up, the lens is open all the way up to like a 2.8, a 1.5, or a 3.1, as I just showed you, that has less depth of field. So there's going to be less things in focus. So specifically, you decide where in the shot things are in focus. So the shot you're looking at me right now is at a 3, if I remember correctly, and it gives me a shallower depth of field. So again, my hand's out of focus, the background's out of focus. If I had that at 22, I'd probably have the background in focus and myself in focus. So that's the really cool thing, is that correlation of the lens plus focus and then what's in focus. Otherwise, just like a phone, you're deciding where things are in focus. So you can tap, sometimes the phones decide the background's of focus. Usually it's thinking that what's in the foreground or the person, the subjects are in focus. And that's the same idea. You decide, in manual digital cinematography, what is in focus. And you simply, again, you spin the ring, and we'll get a close-up of it on the other camera, but it's basically, in meters and feet, what is in focus. So right now I have it set at about a 1 meter focus from the camera to my face is 1 meter. And that's what decides that I'm in focus. If I set it for 3 meters, I'd be out of focus. If I set it for 20 centimeters, I'd be out of focus as well. So that's really crucial. But again, depth of field, if I set it for 1 meter, I have a higher depth field because it's at f22, then the background could be in focus too, theoretically. So that's really a really fun aspect of how it works, right? So you're deciding what's in focus. That range, it can be shallow or deep, as I mentioned here. It can be 1 meter, it can be 20 meters. And then when things in the background are in focus plus the foreground, you're basically working with something called infinity focus. Once the background's in focus and beyond, there's no longer an area where things are out of focus. So that's a really fun part where usually a landscape shot, you're focusing to infinity and you're seeing everything in focus in the background. Okay, so again, here, just a recap and just kind of in text here so we can see this. So you can, exposure and depth of field. So manual aperture allows the operator to control the depth of the field by opening or closing the aperture, smaller or larger f-stop. So the smaller the f-stop equals less depth of field. The larger the f-stop, the more depth of field. And we're going to demonstrate exactly what that looks like. So that's really simple way to do a little bit extra with our focus, and that's the real creative fun part. And it's not. It sounds a little bit complicated, but this is the thing why I encourage, if you take out the camera and you play around with these scenarios, you'll really get a quick handle on it and understand, how this works and the correlations. And in the demonstration you'll see today, I hope that will help explain it further. Okay, so shallow depth of field. Here's a sample from a shot. Notice that the foreground and background are not in focus. So the foreground is another actor, their face, and they're holding like a little puppet. It's all out of focus, and the background's out of focus as well. So essentially only the actor in the middle ground, if you will, is in focus. So that this is a example of shallow depth of field. So only having a certain area in focus. So that's the shallow depth of field. Okay, so now here's like a deep depth of field, and notice that the trees in the foreground they're in focus a bit too, and then the soldiers are in focus, and then all the way to the background is almost in focus. Now it's not a total extreme depth of field, but there's definitely more in focus than this previous example where really close to the actor, 2 feet from his face, that stuff's out of focus, and 2 feet behind him's out of focus, or about 1 meter in front and behind. Whereas here you can see the trees 10 meters in advance are maybe slightly out of focus, but you can see that there's, probably 20, 30 meters of depth of field with the soldiers and a couple of the trees in front of them and behind them. And these trees are about 8 meters apart. So there's a lot of depth of field here. So that's kind of a good example of how that can work, both ways. Now the final variable as well is the actual frame rates. And it's kind of an extra variable, so I didn't mention it in the beginning as much, but it's, what is your frame rate? So the higher the frame rate, the more frames per second, you also require more light, as each frame has less time to be exposed. So for example, 60 frames per second filming, a lot of people like to do 60 frames per second, let's say for HD filming, you're shooting basically 1/60th or almost 1/20th, 120th of a second. Versus if you're shooting in 24 frames, you're 1/24th of a second. So essentially to expose 60 frames per second versus 24 frames per second, you need more than double the amount of exposure time. And so you almost need double the light to properly expose it. So that's something to think about. Higher frame rates require more light effectively because there's more frames per second, so you have less time to expose each frame. It's not just a given. So the higher the frame rate, so if you start to get into slow motion frame rates, if you take your phone, like an iPhone or an iPad, you put it into slow motion mode, you'll notice that if you go into slow motion mode, everything gets a bit darker if there's not enough light. So if you're like in a low light situation, it gets really dark because it's high frame rates. That means it needs that many more frames to shoot, and it needs that much more light to expose at that frame rate. So it's giving you a digital representation of what that frame rate is going to look like. Versus 24 frames, it needs a lot less light. So that's why I personally love filming in 24 frames, because it doesn't need the most amount of light, and it effectively can allow me to film in pretty low light situations using these Blackmagic cinema cameras and different lenses. So the lens kits that we put together at the libraries, they're also fast lenses, so they work at about 1.5 to 2 in terms of their f-stop, so they're pretty fast. That's pretty fast because you'll notice a lot of lenses can be up to 4 f4 starting, so they're a lot slower. So that one stop can really also help with using less light, for example, and that's a good variable. So that's the last thing here, is a frame rate variable, and I think that's important because it can be quite useful too. And to understand that as you change frame rates, as you decide frame rates, if you're going to be shooting in a really dark environment, maybe consider something like 24 frames instead of shooting in 60 frames, because that can help you, achieve your results in using available light versus having to bring a lot of extra light. So that could be, very, very effective in terms of, how that works out. Okay, so let's get right into the demo now. So I'm going to just switch over here to this camera. And so I have a 50 millimeter lens, and that's available in the two kits. So the kits, they come with a 16 millimeter, a 35 millimeter, a 50 millimeter, and an 85 millimeter lens. That's essentially what our kits come with. So the 16 millimeter is kind of your wide angle lens, so that's more for landscapes, wide shots, or establishing shots of a room, so you can see everything in the room. The 35 millimeter is, what I like to call is a normal lens, so that's representing our eyesight to quite a degree. Again, what you're looking at me through is a 35 millimeter focal length, and that's looks very much like as if you're sitting across the room from me. So that's why I like to use that type of a lens in doing the web presentation, because it looks like your eyesight and you're seeing me that way. The 50 millimeter is kind of, often in photography, it's called a portrait lens. So that gives you a little bit of a closer. So it'd be like more of just my head in this kind of a distance. And it gives you, it's not a real close up, but it just gives you that little bit more of a portrait effect. So a lot of people like the 50 millimeter for the dialogue or getting people's interviews. It's a great, great lens. And that's what we're demonstrating here. This is a 50 millimeter on this camera. So, and then finally, the 85 millimeter starts to get into a telephoto lens. So 85 millimeter, you'd be kind of seeing more of just like my eyes in this distance, versus, the 60 millimeter, you'd see more of the outside room, and so on. And then the other camera here, this one, I have to get some power on that one, but the other camera there is going to provide us with a bit of a an option to be able to see, a bit of a close up of the actual the lens and the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera as we go through the different settings on it and so on. So I'm just going to power up this other camera here. Just bear with me for a moment. And the great thing is when you're doing, if you're going to do any kinds of tests, the actual plugs for the cameras are available, so you can just power them up with regular electrical outlets. And that's always a really nice thing, because it's always cool to be able to demonstrate and work with things for hours versus not being able to see things because you run out of battery power, right? So it's really nice to be able to do that. So okay, so here we go. So here's our image right now. So I have so here I'm just going to here it is open all the way up, and this is a 1.5. And now what I'm going to do is let's just first look at the exposure, and I think that's a good demonstration. So we're going from our exposure, and then we're going to go all the way down to 22, and we see how it goes totally dark, right? So it's way too dark. So again, what is the right amount of exposure? So in this case, I'm in a pretty good range, and what I've put on is there's something called the zebra mode, and the zebra mode will show me if I'm getting too bright, and that's a great way to just understand what's correct in the exposure and stuff. So for this kind of an image, what is the right amount of exposure? So to me, that seems, I always like to underexpose a little bit. I highly recommend that for digital cinematography, is just to underexpose a bit, because it's easier to bring things up later in post than to, try to bring things down. So it's a bit different than maybe some of you are used to, but one of the important things is, generally we're trying to, underexpose a touch, and then we can boost it a bit in our color grading and post-production process. That's always a pretty neat thing to be able to do. So what does that look like again? So here we are, and now what we have here too is we have a histogram. This gives us a general idea of the entire image. So if we're kind of, you know, here to the back, it's showing me it's a little bit darker. And watch as I open it up. If I go brighter, it kind of puts the image right kind of in the middle. So that would be like kind of your, you know, ideal, and again, if that's, I would say great exposure, kind of in the middle like that. You don't want to have too much peaking on the highest point over here, and you don't want to have too much on the bottom, like crushing into the dark areas. So that's kind of, you want that middle area, gives you a good idea of what your exposure is doing. Now, right now I have the ISO at 320. So I'm going to push the ISO button and I'm going to bring it up to, let's go all the way to 12. Let's go over to 1600. And now what you'll see is, see all of these lines, those are called zebra lines. So it's way, way overexposed, right? Like that. So now what I can do, so I'm going to bring it down until the zebra lines go away. And you can see then the exposure looks great at that point. So those zebra lines, you can just turn them on or off, and that lets you know that your exposure is correct. That's how easy it is to work with manual exposure with that zebra assist essentially. And how we can turn that on, you just go over to the menu and it's just here in the middle. I can turn zebra on or off. So right now you can see it's on, and then I can turn it off there. So again, if I go into, see it's really, really bright, and I can turn it on or off just like that. So in this case, you can see again, once I bring the exposure down, zebras are gone, those lines, and I know my exposure is correct. So that's how we manually expose. And the ISO, again, it's a bit of a, you know, what do I need in order to expose? That's really what it comes down to. What do you need to expose? So you could see we were working at 320 ISO, and that was okay. I can also work at 1600, and you know, and that's fine too. Now, I've closed down to an f5.6. I can probably close down a little bit more. And what's happening now is I'm going to have more depth of field in terms of what's in focus. So that's the next step. So we've done our ISO, we've done our exposure to expose it properly, and our histogram, we don't have anything too high up here. We don't have anything too dark down there. And again, I like to always underexpose by about a stop. I find that you can always bring it up a little bit in the post-production process. And now we decide what's in focus. So look at this. If I'm on here, you can see the background's out of focus. And now the background's in focus. Right? So we can, or we make this guy in focus. And we decide if the pumpkins are in focus and our moose is in focus. So this is where we get into that depth of field area where we have the pumpkin all the way to, he's in focus as well. And we were able to achieve that because we've gone up to an f-stop of 8. So remember again those variables. If we have a smaller number on the f-stop, we're wide open, and we have a shallower depth of field. If I close the aperture, we end up with a greater depth of field, so more things can be in focus. So let's go all the way to 22. So you can see that's pretty dark. What I'm going to do now is go to my ISO, and I'm going to bring it up with my ISO. And you can see there's a lot of noise that starts to happen. But what happens is we start to get way more in focus. So my background's in focus and my foreground's in focus. And let's just turn off the focus assist. Right, so that's what's happening there. Right, so it's you know, I start to get the background in focus. I start to get that, but you can see there's a noise, and that's because we've put it up to 8,000 ISO. Now, alternatively, again, now let's go back to what we had before, which was ISO of 320. You can see it's totally dark, and now I'm going to start to open it up. Okay, I'm going to open it all the way up to the 1. I'm going to go to about 2. And look how shallow the depth of field is now. Now I'm struggling to have the pumpkin and the moose in focus. So this part's out of focus, but I just have this part in focus. So the depth of field is probably only about 5 centimeters. This is out of focus, and right behind the moose is out of focus. You can see with my hand. Starts to get into focus here, focus there, and then again out of focus. So now I'm at 320 ISO. I'm at an f-stop of 2, and I have a very shallow depth of field. So that's how we deal with that. The exposure is good, but now you can see we're dealing with the a shallower depth of field. So I'm just going to go to 2.8, and that still looks really good to me because that's just underexposed. So I like that about a stop on underexposing a little bit more. And you can see again, we still have, this is out of focus a bit, but a little bit more in focus now. So you can see our depth of field is much better. Now I have my whole still life in this shot in focus. And again, the background's out of focus. So with manual focus, I can decide, hey, I want the background in focus, or I want this in focus, or I can, have something in the foreground in focus. So this is about half a meter in front of the subject, right? So you can be all out of focus. You can imagine like a subject pops in and says, hey, hello, and that's in focus, and then the background stays out of focus. So that's kind of brings us to the next thing, is that you can also decide to change your focus. And then that's what we can do. We can pull focus in cinematography, which is really fun. So we can, go from background images to foreground images. And it's a very cinematic method that we can change focus and shift focus. And that allows you to kind of guide the audience in terms of what they're seeing, how they're seeing it, and when they're seeing things. So I always find that, quite an interesting tool in terms of, what things look like. So again, right now I'm in the 23.98 frames per second mode, and I'm just going to show you guys if I go up to 60, how much darker it is. So again, look how dark that is. Right? So the 60 frame mode, I have to actually, compensate for it. So if I stay in the 23.98, it's allowing me to stay in that mode. So actually, I just have to switch over the cameras because it won't let me show you guys directly the demonstration. But see how it gets a lot darker? So then you have to actually open it up. So let's go to the 2.8 that I had it at. So here's 2.8. You can see how much darker that is. It's 60 frames. And then if I go back to 23.98, it's a lot brighter. So it's twice as bright essentially, because there's less frames per second requiring that exposure time. So it's a great way to be able to to work with less light in the 24 frames mode. So just be aware, if you want to shoot in 60 frames, you're going to need a little bit more light. So that's one of those compensation factors as well that's going to be required. So that's basically our manual. So you can see again, this is out of focus, that's in focus background, right? So you can see how, if there's a bit of this foreground, there's this person sitting here, your middle ground, and then you have the background out of focus. Now here's a great way to look at how I can pull focus. So I can go, okay, this person's talking, la 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 la, and then I can go pull focus to that subject, and then maybe there's someone talking behind. And look how I can guide the viewer to, who they should be paying attention to in a conversation between three people. So it's a great storytelling tool in terms of how to, guide people through the conversations and to make that work. Okay, so now let me spin this over. I just want to make sure everyone understands, what this looks like on the lens, and just where they're pretty. All these lenses are pretty standard in terms of, how they work and so on. So we'll just go over some of these manual modes. So essentially, right here we have our f-stops, and you can see it's like 1, 2, and it's all just numbered. So there's the first ring that's closest to the sensor, closest to the camera, is going to be all your f-stops and your aperture. The next ring is going to be all your measurements in terms of the distance of what's in focus. And then to remove these lenses, these prime lenses, these manual cine lenses, you push this button and you spin counterclockwise and it comes off. And then you basically have just a red dot, and it lines up with the red dot on the front of the camera, which is right here. So the dot to dot, go like this, dot to dot here, and you spin it clockwise and it clicks in. Then you know it's on. So never let go until you have that clicked in sound, and we know that we're good to go. So here, just again, a little bit of a closer shot. You can see the, right? So here's our aperture, all our numbers, right? So that first ring, right? Going from 1.1 and so on. And then this one, you can see these are in meters and feet. 0.5, 2 feet, 0.5 meters, and so on. And there's lines. The line right here in the top is telling me where the f-stop is and where my focus is. So you can actually measure the distances from the camera over to the subject with a tape measure, and you know exactly what's in focus. So it's a really great tool to be able to work with that method of control, because you totally can control, you know, what's in focus. So here's, you know, what's just changing the aperture and then deciding what's in focus. So if I take a tape measure from the camera all the way to the subject, so this looks like about a meter. If I look at the top here, it says 1.2 meters. So visually, yeah, it represents exactly what I expect it to represent in terms of the overall you know, distance, and that's how we deal with our manual exposure. So that's all we have in terms of the manual exposure and how that works. And I think, you know, hopefully that sheds some light on the different tools, how to get started with the manual exposure and manual focus with the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera. Again, you can take these out, just go to our website, tbmcs.ca. Go there, you go scroll down, get to the online proficiency, complete it for the camera if you haven't already done so. Then we see it, there's videos you watch, it goes over the camera thoroughly so you can feel comfortable. You go through that test, then we add your name into the database and we attach it to your library card. So all you need is a library card at the Blue Mountains Public Library or Wasaga Beach Public Library, and you can take out this equipment. And it's you know, fantastic 1 week rentals and then a loan, and it's just like taking out a book. Take it, go through it, and explore all these manual lenses and how to do manual exposure and focus, and you'll see there's a whole other language in terms of storytelling that you can tell in terms of the audience, the lighting, and you know, what you're exposing and the depth of field, and you get a very cinematic look, and that's really why they're called a digital cinema camera. It's a fantastic camera and tool. I just want to thank again all our partners in this project, Canada Council for the Arts, and then we have all our library partners, Blue Mountains Public Library, Collingwood Public Library, Wasaga Beach Public Library. You can rewatch this session right here with the same link. It's going to be available, and we're also going to post it on our YouTube channel in the coming couple weeks as well. We're going to do all the updates for our September-October session. So thanks again for joining me. Really appreciated being able to go over this with you. And if you have any questions, tom@tbmcs.ca. And otherwise, I will see you again soon. All the best and take care.